So welcome, everyone. We're going to get started with this webcast today. I'm Pat Soldano, president of Family Enterprise USA. If you don't know who we are, we advocate for family-owned businesses and their lifetime of savings. All size of business, small, medium, and large, and all industries. We are your voice in Washington, D.C. at a national level. We work on tax and economic issues that affect families of family businesses. If you'd like to help in our work in Washington, D.C., please go to our website, which is also in the chat, and join our work and become a member. So I'm very pleased with this webcast today because, as I mentioned earlier, we've had a lot of attention and a lot of people sign up for this webcast. Today, we are going to talk about how shifting geopolitics, demographics, and investment strategies are shaping the future of family office talent. You're joining us today for an insightful discussion on the key trends impacting hiring, leadership, transition, and talent retention in 2025. And we're very pleased to have with us two experts in this field who've been in the industry, the family office industry, for a long time. Linda Mack, founder and president of Mack International, has more than 25 years' experience spanning family offices, wealth management, human resources, and financial services. Linda has built a reputation as a thought leader in the industry. She frequently speaks at global family office conferences and is absolutely a recognized authority in her field. Linda and I have known each other over 2 decades, and she absolutely is the resource to go to for talent in office industry. Also very pleased to have with us today Brian Adams, who is a partner at Mack International, specializing in C-suite executive search and human capital consulting for family offices and enterprise. Brian is the co-founder and co-chairman of a global network of family office professionals committed to service and generational leadership, and the co-founder of Samaras 22, which connects single-family offices through curated events and experiences. So, again, welcome. Great to have both of you on this webcast today.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you, Pat. Delighted to be here.
So we're going to conduct this webcast in a question and answer format. I have a list of questions that I'm going to ask both Brian and Linda, and they're going to figure out who's going to answer those questions. And then we also have some questions that people have written in when they registered for this webcast, and we'll attempt to get to some of those as well. So the webcast is based on an article that was written by Linda and Brian on 2025 talent predictions for family offices. So Linda and Brian, in that most recent article, you talk about the change in the leadership of family offices and how there's increased allocations to alternative investment asset classes and renewed discussions around outsourcing. Specifically, you talk about the outsourced chief investment officer model and its rise in popularity. So can you speak to us about that, please? And also, while you're talking about that new role as a chief investment officer, give us kind of the pros and cons of outsourcing versus keeping that role in-house.
So I think, and maybe I'll start off and let Brian add his comments as well. But I think that, the many families will choose to outsource and look to the outsourced CIO model because that gives them access to what they would consider to be, top talent and people who have the connections to the top managers and top investment opportunities globally. And yet they can do that by sharing cost with other clients, if you will, rather than having it in-house. The cost of having an in-house investment team, CIO and an investment team, is very, very expensive. Many families do choose to go that route, but it's one that you need to have enough critical mass to make it an economic solution. But let me let Brian jump in here.
Yeah, I think what we've seen historically is family offices, if they're multi-generational and have been around for a while, are typically funded from an administrative support perspective. So they handle taxes, accounting, those type of functions, and they don't come from an investment background. In other words, the family had an operating company that was in manufacturing or something other than financial services. And the investment piece, like Linda said, can be extremely expensive and onerous. And so the OCIO model is a great option for many families that don't come from that investing world themselves. I will say, like everything, there's pros and cons, and I'll hand it back off to Linda here in a minute. One of the trends we have been seeing in the space is the OCIO model has been challenging for some groups because they are servicing a wide spectrum of clients. So they have institutional, non-taxable entities, as well as taxable large families, and then even some ultra high net worth individuals. So it can be a very challenging business. We've seen the margins get squeezed fairly well in that space. I think that's why you're seeing quite a bit of M&A take place. But I think the boutique OCIO model still makes a lot of sense for a lot of families. And increasingly, we're seeing families that have some type of internal investment professional working in a hybrid approach with an OCIO function adjacent to the family itself. And maybe, Linda, you can give some commentary on kind of trends and what you're seeing and hearing from our clients.
I think one of the things we are seeing in the market is I think the OCIO model makes a lot of sense for people, particularly what we see is when they're initially starting a family office. Rather than at the beginning, building an in-house investment platform, we see a lot of families, they have a major liquidity event, they embark on building a family office, and they say, look, why don't we partner up with some people who are really expert in what they do out there, and let's learn and go that route. Maybe later on, they'll decide to bring some things in-house, but it may not be the whole platform. They'll still use the OCIO. We have a number of families who will look for co-investment opportunities through the OCIO. I think that there certainly are a lot of cost consideration, and it's also the management responsibility and the keeping employees, the retention issues that go along with having an in-house investment platform and so forth. So I do think particularly the stage of the life cycle of the family office has a bearing on that decision tree as well. And I think we do see many more families at the early stages of their family office, particularly outsourcing, using the service of an outsourced CIO, and then may decide later on to bring in portions of the asset classes to manage in-house.
So follow up on that, because I think it's a really important point that both of you made about the costs. So what happens, someone sells their business, they have liquidity, they're now going to manage that liquidity, and they're going to create a family office to do that, which sometimes creating their own single family office makes sense and sometimes it doesn't, as we know. But let's assume they create a single family office and, people like to invest. People like to play the stock market, right? So they decide, well, I made widgets. I know how to invest. I'm going to be the investment person. Or I better bring in somebody that knows how to be the investment person. And to your point, unless they grew up in the investment world, they may or may not have that talent, and they may or may not know how to hire that talent. But at what point, and it's extremely expensive and sophisticated talent, at what point or size does it make sense for a single family office to have their own investment team, not just from a net asset point, but from the liquidity standpoint? Because they may have liquid or illiquid assets, part of that nest egg that maybe that CIO manages and maybe doesn't, right? So maybe you could give us some guidance around the size and the scope of the family office.
I think that some of it will depend on the scope of types of investments they want to make, because that will indicate complexity, and that has a correlation to cost. But I would say, off the top of my head, I'd say $1 billion. If you don't have $1 billion plus, then we go through an exercise with our clients and say, would you like an if you're going to bring it in-house and build it in-house, would you like an A player, a B player, a C player? And obviously the answer is an A player. Okay. Now, how are you going to handle due diligence? How are you going to handle sourcing? How are you going to handle this, that, and the other? And you start to build up quite a budget requirement if you are going to do it in-house. That's when a lot of people say, whoa, I didn't think it was going to be that expensive. And you say, well, then maybe you want to think about another alternative, which is finding an A player, top-notch group of investment folks, but sharing the economics with other clients. You don't get to be the one and only that they're dedicated to, but maybe you get the trade-off is that you get the high-level talent. You have to share it for economic purposes, but you still get, at the end of the day, you get well served. But back to your initial question, I would say $1 billion at least.
Okay. That's helpful. Yep.
Ryan, do you?
Well, yeah, I think it's an important point because people don't realize how difficult it is to create that investment services in their office and the expenses you just articulated. And also, then you also need to have someone that's very knowledgeable and experienced and can bring in the right deals, the right investments, and have that network and those contacts also, correct?
Absolutely. And that's where a lot of people go off track. They may think they came from an industry and therefore they have the domain expertise and they're going to be able to access top opportunities on the investment front. And it doesn't always work out that way. In fact, I think many people get surprised that, in fact, it doesn't work out that way. I don't know, Brian, if you want to add on that, just the sourcing and the leveraging relationships.
Yeah. A dynamic we often see as a first generation wealth creator or liquidity event. Oftentimes, there's this huge urge and need to bring in an investment person to allocate the capital and to invest. We often will caution them to pump the brakes, take a step back and think about structure, governance, and organization before those things happen. You can't really unwind the clock when you start allocating capital. And another dynamic that Linda talks about a lot that really gets underappreciated, and Pat, you alluded to this, keeping the investment team fed with fresh capital is also really important. So if there's no longer an operating company making distributions, and you are going to be investing in illiquid private alternatives, you need to be mindful of the ability to keep the investment team busy. Because oftentimes they will deploy the capital as fast as you give it to them. And that's where the alignment of incentives is really important, to putting together compensation structures and governance structures that make sense for the family and the investment professional. I think to kind of tie it together with what you're seeing in today's marketplace, that's why you're seeing increasingly internal investment teams spin out and start raising third-party capital or bring on third-party partners, or families have an outward-facing investment profile to club up with other families because they've learned that lesson over the last generation or two.
Well, since we're talking about outsourcing, let's talk about other services of single-family offices or family offices that are being outsourced. Or maybe you could tell us about some of those.
I think in most cases, probably the ones that are outsourced most would be estate planning. People may have internal, the larger the family, the more likely they will have internal people who may be trust administrators, or they may have a private trust company. But still, I'd say the estate planning, it is more typical that families will have attorneys, specialists in estate planning to work with them. And they may have internal people coordinating that effort, but they will use the benefit of somebody external. General counsel is also, and particularly legal in specialized areas, is typically outsourced as opposed to finding it in-house. We're seeing a trend toward more general counsels starting to come into family offices. But there it's really in the context of the first pair of eyes to see something to determine whether they can answer the question internally as a generalist or whether they need to engage outside counsel as specialists, and then they can coordinate and manage that effort. Brian, do you want to add on that?
Yeah, I think you're seeing it on both sides of the table in most financial and professional services industries, law, accounting, tax, investments. You're seeing a hyper specialization of subject matter expertise. And to Linda's point, a lot of these families are very focused on advanced estate planning techniques and structure. Given those are often just a one-time project-oriented pursuit, it doesn't make sense to have internal capabilities full-time for things like that. So you often will see them outsourced. Same would go for some of the tax functionalities. Again, if you're instituting, say, the lender structure, that's a pretty heavy lift, and you want to make sure that you've got the right professionals in place. It's not something that you particularly need full-time in-house once it's implemented and your internal team and compliance folks understand it. But I think this all goes back to the initial conversation of what are your priorities, and your budget reflects your values and your priorities, right? So an examination for the family of what they really want to prioritize and value, it could be concierge lifestyle management that could be extremely important to them. Well, then you should have that in-house. You should understand that you're going to pay more than potentially a third-party outsourced solution. Whereas if, that doesn't matter as much to you, then it would make sense to outsource that. And that's this big initial conversation that I think a lot of people miss when they're trying to understand, should they be holistic or should they have more of a a la carte offering when it comes to how their family office is organized?
Well, and both of you touched on cost. So I think that's important, of course, when you're setting up a family office or that family office is operating from generation to generation, costs always increase. So let's talk about what some people are doing to help mitigate those costs, and that's the virtual family office. What have you seen around that, and how common do you see a virtual family office?
I think we're seeing more of it. And I think that we have seen it more with next generation family members who may not feel the need or the desire to control it all by having all the staff in-house. I think they're trade-offs. I would say at the end of the day, if you are a virtual family office, you still need what we describe as the expert generalist to lead your family office. Somebody needs to be able to see across the whole horizontal spectrum of the wealth management functional areas and see the interplay between them all. So all of those verticals that comprise the functional areas, somebody needs to be able to see across and make sure they're all coordinated. If you have internal people doing it, sometimes that's easier to have that integrated approach. If you are operating in a virtual family office, whoever is the leader of your family office, whether it's a family member or non-family member, somebody needs to coordinate the work of all of the external providers and advisors, and to be able to see if somebody is working in one vertical, what other verticals are affected, and ensure that there's coordination between them so that nothing falls through the cracks. But it can be a very effective model. I think you certainly don't have the management requirement, direct management requirement, and retention of staff and so forth. You can rely on your providers and advisors for that, but it still requires a lot of coordination and a lot of oversight to make it work.
Yeah.
So Brian, did you want to comment on that?
Yeah, my commentary around this would be, I think the two biggest challenges for families today are technology and talent, and I think they're intertwined often. So what you're seeing increasingly, what Linda mentioned, you're seeing the advent of some technological solutions allow for less overhead internally within the family office, and especially within that middle management middle bench of some services, which makes sense. And there's some great solutions out there. They're getting better every day. Investor reporting, general ledger, communications, etc. But what that's done is increase the roles and responsibilities for the senior leadership, because now they're coordinating amongst more third-party service providers. They have to understand how their internal tech stack works, and their reporting requirements and communication requirements are increased. And so you're seeing this need for, like Linda's coin, this expert generalist, this person who's a subject matter expert across all the disciplines of wealth and asset management. It's become a much bigger job, frankly, because they're now doing what potentially was before 2 or 3 different roles, all internal. And I only see that increasing moving forward.
Well, and so we do have a couple questions in the chat. And the first one from Richard, I think, is probably not something you're going to be able to address on this call, but just maybe you could touch on it, which is what type of total comp do you see for the CIO function and other admin services? That's a big question, but maybe you could just make some general comments about that.
I think I would say in terms of the total comp, to give a discrete dollar is pretty tough. You can give it broad range. I always say, what's the cost of a CIO? It could be 200,000. It could be 2 million plus. But part of the reason for that broad of an answer is, what is the actual job being done? For example, on one side of the spectrum, you have a total outsourced model. You have somebody who's engaged, a consultant or an outsourced CIO, who is doing all of the research, making all of the recommendations. Maybe has discretion, maybe doesn't, but all of the work is being done externally, and there's oversight happening from the family office. So if that person's carrying a title of CIO, but they're not really performing a lot of the functions, that on the other end of the spectrum, you have the CIO who starts from scratch, investment policy, all the allocation, all of the diligence, all of the sourcing, all of the portfolio construction, and so on and so forth. So there's quite a broad range. So it's not ducking the question. It's just saying that there is a direct correlation between scope, complexity, and the details of what the person is doing that directly correlate to the compensation. There are other factors too today, co-invest and carried interest. If those are part of the equation, how do you're kind of looking at compensation as cash, but then also some other elements if you're getting into co-invest and carried interest type of considerations.
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. And it's hard to answer without any of the specifics. But Brian, maybe you could answer this other question in the chat, which is, what things should not be outsourced?
I think it goes back to what the priorities, right? I mean, Linda always talks about the 3 legs of the stool, either as a de novo family office or when you're going through a potential large senior leadership transition as an opportunity to revisit. But one is to define who the clients being served are, right? Is it just one principal? Is it the entire family? Is it potentially former business partners that participate in the liquidity event? There's no judgment associated with any of it, but you have to understand what the client cohort looks like and what that population looks like. The second would be what the services being provided are. Is it truly holistic? Are you going to be doing white glove, concierge lifestyle management, estate management, plain pleasure craft, investments, tax, accounting, cyber? Or are you going to pick and choose some things that you think the family office should be providing as a service? And then the third would be, what is insourced versus outsourced? And I think that all goes to this bigger question now that a lot of families are looking at the family office as a standalone business entity. It has its own P&L, it has its own inputs and outputs, and really understanding how are we going to achieve kind of a net neutral position, or are there going to be some things that are going to be loss leaders because we really care about them and we're comfortable with that decision. But sitting down and going through that thought process, that will all come, I think, to the conclusion of what should or shouldn't be outsourced. Typically, privacy, control, discretion are the main drivers behind starting the family office. And if those things are still really important to the family, then they should be insourced. If it doesn't fall within that priority list, then I think you should go to market, run an RFP, a proper bake-off, and see what the third-party options are. And I think that should be a continuous process too, frankly. Really high-achieving families will go to market often, depending on how important that relationship is and how deep the relationship is. But that would be best practice, is to having a rolling RFP where certain things are taken to market. You understand what fees are, who the other players are, what else has happened in the landscape across there. So it should be a continuous process, in my opinion, frankly.
One of the thing that I personally think that any family of substantial wealth should have, this could be a family member or non-family member, but that expert generalist, I'd say, needs to be on the family side of the table. I think you want a totally unconflicted, I'd say you want somebody who's on your payroll. They are beholden only to you. You can outsource everything else under the sun, but you want somebody on your side of the table, totally unconflicted, that serves you and coordinates the work of whoever those providers are that you decide to outsource to.
Yeah, I'm a recovering attorney, and I still really think of the world as fiduciary or non-fiduciary. And there are some great service providers in the marketplace that we think exceedingly high of, but they have multiple clients, and they don't wake up in the morning just thinking about you necessarily. As to Linda's point, that first hire, no matter what their background is or what their focus is, having them only thinking about the principal and the family when they wake up in the morning, it's a lot to be said for having somebody like that on your side.
So everyone's talking about next generation. So let's get into that, because in your article, you talked about the next generation taking a greater and more visible role in the family office, which will require more education of that generation and could result in more focus on family and family office security concerns or issues. So maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Brian, I'm going to let you take this one first.
I've been around the space long enough that I remember that you used to had to be 25 or under to be a next gen, and then they pushed it to 30, and then it was 40, 50, and now there's no age associated with whatsoever. And, it's now rising gen and all these different terms. It's a challenge. I think the interesting part is we're now in a world where you have multiple generational cohorts working alongside one another in a lot of these families, right? Where you could have 3 generations working simultaneously together. It's an interesting kind of world to be in. I don't think it's as painful a dynamic as it's made out to be. I mean, families have been figuring this out for a long time. So, I'm a non-lineal next gen, I guess, technically, married into my wife's family and been a part of that community for a long time. I think it's an interesting opportunity, but yeah, I don't know. Linda, you might have better perspective on this, frankly.
Oh, I agree with everything you said. I think, kind of turning back, Pat, to your question about security and so forth, I think the more visible people are, the more easily found they are, and that makes them vulnerable. That makes them vulnerable to some of the technology scamming or the banking scamming, potentially, kidnapping, or, those are extremes. But nevertheless, I think before, people were so well hidden and you couldn't find them. And now next gens tend to be much more open. They post on Facebook when they're going on vacation. I always kiddingly say, you locked the front door, but you left all the windows open. So, I think that there are security concerns, if only just people targeting you to send you phony phishing things to get you to try to wire money or whatnot. So I think that the more visible families of wealth become, and the more their next gens are open and visible around these things, the more you become a potential target, and the more you just need to be responsible about protecting yourself and your family. And that's, cybersecurity. It's a variety of things. We know most families have people try to do an audit on them, so to speak, or crack them And then they find where the holes are or where the vulnerabilities are, and then go back and help them plug those holes. But that's an ongoing process because it's these scammers and everything. Now they're mapping your voice. I mean, there's a lot of different things going on that people are getting caught in these things. So I think all of us have to be mindful of that. But the more visible you are and the wealthier you are, the more you're going to be a target for people.
Yeah, I think
It's interesting.
Go
I was
ahead.
just going to say, Brian, we asked this question in Family Enterprise USA's annual survey around, have you been had a cyber experience or attack? And if so, what was it? And it's interesting that until this year, the percent really wasn't that high, and the percent's gone up 3 times this year. So you're absolutely right. Something's happening. Go ahead, Brian.
Well, I was going to say, I think Linda mentioned this earlier, but the rise of the internal general counsel that often turns into the chief risk officer this is part of that spectrum of risk that goes across investments, insurance, digital footprint, cyber. It keeps getting heightened. And again, to go back to what I was saying earlier about the hub and spoke, it's great to have an internal resource there and they can be incredible, but that space is moving so quickly. Cyber, for instance, in IT, unless you're an embedded family office that can leverage these other resources, that's probably something that makes a lot of sense to investigate as a potential third-party outsourced solution because it's such a technically concise and evolving world that it should be a priority for a lot of families.
Well, so we were talking about next gen, and so what comes along with next gen is, and to your point, Brian, we don't really know what that age is anymore, but
I think I'm still qualified, but I don't know. I've a lot of gray hair these days.
so we'll just call it next gen, which is all ages, I guess. But basically, the next generation of the family office coming up and participating in the family office. We talked about the security concerns. How do you endear and promote those values, those family values from one generation to the next? And maybe you could discuss the wealth transfer along with that value transfer. What are the foundational blocks of a succession strategy? And when and how, this is the question, it should be implemented and communicated. Because we all know implemented isn't always the same as communicated.
I would start, and I'll throw it back to Brian in a second, but I think that early and often, kind of like working out, you don't go work out once and expect that you're going to get the benefit of what you would have if you did it every day. I often use, and it may be outdated, but the family dinner used to be the family meeting time at night when you talked about values. You talked about who were the good guys, who were the bad guys, family history, family values. That was an hour a day when you got to share a lot of those things. People are now busy going different directions, but I think it's still looking for ways in which to create the opportunity for telling the stories, for sharing the examples, for imparting those values. Brian's own family, they go and work at a soup kitchen together on holidays. I mean, it's things like that start to promote that value, but it's got to be a recurring theme. It's not something that you just do once a year or you do at a family meeting once a quarter. It's got to be an ongoing thing. With that, let me turn it to Brian.
Yeah, and I don't think there's any secret sauce here. I think it's early. I will say that the ability for families to be flexible and code switch across generations, that's a skill that we're seeing increasingly needed by this expert generalist that families are hiring, somebody that can put together a 100-page board book and snail mail it delivery to certain members of the board or family, but then also create a 3-minute video snippet that they text some folks who just are never going to read that board book, let alone open the attachment on an email, and everything across the spectrum. So we're seeing more kind of multimodal communication requirements for these families because people digest information much differently. I mean, my boys are 12 and 9, and they just don't digest media the same way that I do, and I've got to meet them where they are. I think that's the biggest piece is increased communication, but also creativity and flexibility around the communication channels themselves.
I think that's another element too the trend in outsourcing, because some of these things people feel that they can't afford to have the scale internally to be able to address all these various variations on the theme in terms of the requirements for servicing. So sometimes they feel that, to use an outsourced provider enables the scale and technology to be able to deliver print to one person and digital to another type of thing.
So, Brian, you're younger than both Ellen or I, and you have younger children. It just dawned on me. Do you think social media can be helpful in not only explaining these values and exampling values, but instilling those values generation after generation? I mean, it's a new tool.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think every generation since the dawn of time has said that the younger generation is lazy and ineffective and doesn't work as hard as they used to. And I just don't really believe any of that. I work with young people and they're terrific. They're just different, right? And you've got to just kind of come to terms with that, how they operate. I do think social media can be a really powerful tool. What's interesting is now when I put on events or I think about content creation in person, my Mendoza line for what qualifies is it has to be something that they can't find on YouTube or they can't find on Instagram or LinkedIn. So I still think there's a huge place for in-person peer-to-peer experience share, fireside chats, panel discussions with really confidential private Q&A sessions, Jeffersonian dinners, speed networking to some extent. But I think that barrier keeps going higher because my children, when they're curious about something, they'll just go to Claude or an AI service and they'll say, "Hey, teach me about Pokemon. Like, I want to learn about this character." And boom, 5 minutes later, they know what they need to know and they move on to the next thing, right? So understanding the venues and the experiential creation and how you can use that to impart these values, I think is just as important as the actual content itself. So I don't know if that answers your question, Pat, but that's kind of how I think about it with my own kids.
Well, and I think that we've seen examples too where social media has been used very effectively by families from the value standpoint. Pat, you and I know a lot of families that they give you the book. Here's the history. How many kids are going to read the book? But then we've seen other families use, video and other forms of technology, and including social media, to be able to tell the history of the family in a different way, in a digital way, in a video way. Teaching, you mentioned education, having snippets of things. Oh, what is a trust? Okay, you can plug into the family office and find a little module on, what is a trust. So I think that there are ways, as Brian was mentioning, that with technology and the tools available today, a lot of different ways to be able to meet those next gens where they are and be able to get through to them and get them engaged. And once they're engaged, then you have the opportunity to impart values and educate.
That's where the expert generalist is now also the chief learning officer oftentimes. So another hat for them to wear.
Yeah, I actually think that could be a webcast in of itself.
Yeah.
Talking about this, because the history of the values are so important, but we have to use the new tools and the new communication, as you both talked about. So I think that's fascinating. I want to ask you now about the experts that you hire in the C-suite family office. What changes do you see happening? And how are those being addressed via compensation or other benefits? What generally do you see happening with, again, the C-suite family office executives?
I think the starting point is the family office has become much more professional, much more sophisticated, much more institutionalized. It's a professional services business. I think it really requires leadership that has not only the financial and the investment acumen, but they're business people. They need to look at, on the one side of the equation, they're in a professional services business and are providing services to family clients that need to resonate with those clients so that they'll choose to do business with the family office. Even if they're captive, you don't want an unhappy family client. That breeds a lot of issues ultimately in terms of dynamics within the family. So you need somebody who's really strong there. You need them to be very strategic. They've got to be able to anticipate, how is the family going to evolve? What about that service offering? What are the needs? How are we going to scale it? So they've got to be, very strategic and very proactive and very business oriented. They need to have technology. They got to be tech savvy. They don't have to be the expert. But they have to know how to ask the right questions and decide how to engage the right professionals to be able to ensure that they're operating at the highest level of efficiency and continuous improvement. They need to be superb communication skills. They need very high EQ, because the other side of the equation is, number one, you're providing services, but you're also the trusted advisor to family members individually and to the family collectively. And I'd say increasingly, going back to the more visibility, they need to be very well networked in the market. It's interesting. Family offices used to be so secret and hidden and isolated. Today, virtually every search we do, they want the candidate to be well networked. They're not going to share anything confidential, but the point is they're networked and they know where to go to find information about resources that could help the family, about best practices, and so forth. Brian, let me flip it over to you on this.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I think it's really become its own asset class in the industry in a lot of ways. There are now people graduating from college and business school or professional services institutions that aspire to be a family office executive, and you're seeing the marketplace reflect that. They're competing, and we're competing directly with private equity and venture capital, with traditional asset management firms and banks. I think candidates are now seeing the ability to have a really well-rounded financial and professional services experience by working with a family. So you can touch all these different components. You don't get pigeonholed into one specific subject matter expertise, which is really attractive to a lot of people. And then I think you're seeing families recognize that the same opportunity that they have on the investment side in terms of their permanent flexible capital, they also have on compensation, which is why you're seeing a lot more complex compensation structures around co-investment, carried interest, long-term incentive plans, deferred compensation, etc., because it's not only a tool to obtain talent, but also to retain talent.
The other thing I would add is that we look at a family office and we look at the human capital in a family office as a return on investment. It's not a cost. There should be a return on investment and you should be able to see it. And some people say, well, what about, I can see it in taxes. I can see it in investments, performance returns, and so forth. But, we did some work with one family, a multi-generational family. And in that case, the most important criteria were the communication skills and the ability of this person to be able to kind of engage family members in a way that they could talk about the elephant in the room. Because in the absence of that, there were going to be a lot of issues from a dynamic standpoint. And we sat back and we asked the head of the family office, what is it worth to you? What is the price of having someone in your family, leading your family office, who can enable your family to sustain itself and successfully make it to the next generation? And the family member, the patriarch, stepped back and he said, I hadn't really ever thought about that. And I said, it's pretty priceless, isn't it? So I think that there are different ways of looking at return on investment, and I think that that's also become much more prevalent in the family office market.
While talking about comp, one of the people that registered for this call asked, how does the family office comp compare to other industries requiring similar skill sets?
In terms of experience and so forth, I think you'll find increasing or lots of comparability there. I think there is, because I think that when you look for the skills and experience, you're going to find comparable. Otherwise, if you're not paying market, you're going to get poached. I do think, though, that there's a big distinction in someone who is going into a for-profit kind of an organization where revenue is partially what you're being paid for versus a family office where you're really serving a family and you're being paid in that way. And I don't mean that that's less necessarily. I'm just saying it's different.
Mm-hmm. Good point. Brian, you have a comment on that?
The dynamic that I see play out in terms of where compensation is going is a lot of families want typically a foundational technical expertise in law and accounting, tax, etc. Maybe investment banking or private equity, hedge fund, etc. And then they want 20 years of family office experience. So that puts them roughly my age range-ish, oftentimes, my cohort, my vintage. Unfortunately, there just aren't enough of us running around the world to replace the retiring baby boomer leadership generation. And so it's very challenging to find candidates that have that technical expertise, the right experience, and the culture fit and the personality, and the potential relocation, right? So we call it the Swiss cheese effect, where there's a lot of holes that you've got to go through to find the right person. It's competitive, and families that don't pay market, like Linda said, it's hard to retain them these days.
Coming back at your question, Pat, I'd say the more professional and institutional the family office, the more comparable the pay is going to be to the to those relevant markets. Used to be that that wasn't always the case, but I think it's going to become more and more. And I think we're also seeing the trend toward more and more people coming in from the institutional markets to the private market. So that's also driving that professionalism and institutional quality up, and the compensation is along with that. I just read an article the other day that said that Europe and the rest of the world are well behind the U.S. on compensation and probably what we would consider institutional quality family offices.
Well, so that's interesting because one of the people that registered for this call asked the question, do you have a sense as whether leading a family office is becoming more attractive or less attractive position for experienced professionals?
More attractive, for sure.
More attractive.
More and more people are attracted to it. I think that there was a perception in the old days that was kind of where you went for your last job. In many cases, and it wasn't as demanding or as exciting or as stimulating as being in Wall Street and so forth. But I think what we're seeing now is because, again, it's the level of professionalism and sophistication and institutional quality of the family offices are right up there. So I think you're seeing people attracted increasingly, and that trend is continuing from the institutional world to the private family office world.
Yeah, my dance card is full. I was with people calling me.
Then look at all the universities and business schools that are have curriculums now, family office curriculums. So I talk to people every day that, and I don't think it's just because they're seeking donations from families. I think it's because there's real demand in the market by students who, to Brian's earlier point, who want to go into the family office world, and they want a way to be able to get education to give them the background and learning to be able to be better qualified to go into that space.
Well, and some of that's probably because now people know there is such a thing as a family office, right? Linda, when you and I started, nobody knew what a family office was. So now everybody knows what a family office was, and too many people think they need a family office that don't need a family office. But it's definitely changed. But Brian, what do you see in terms of the positions that are in highest demand from family offices?
Yeah. To my earlier point, we have quite a few mandates where the fact pattern is fairly consistent, multi-generational, large, complex institutional family office that is going through a very well organized, planned, but demographic shift of leadership where somebody's been in this seat 15, 20 years, they're now ready to retire. Can we help them find a successor? That would be the expert generalist, CEO, president, most senior non-family member type role. We have a lot of those mandates and we get a lot of those phone calls these days. Um, and then to some extent, we have the de novo startup first hire as well, which, we certainly have a lot of those, but again, same type of role and responsibility and remit. And then I would say following that would be the CFO, CIO. Um, all the investment roles have been a little bit slower lately. I just think given the market and the run up to the election, a lot of people were on the sidelines in terms of figuring out what they wanted to do on the investment side. But we've seen that come back with more investment roles coming recently. But I do think there was a pause leading up to Q4 post holiday. So I would put them in that rank order.
Elena, do you have any?
One that we hear in the market that people are tearing their hair about is accounting
Yeah.
professionals, mid-level accounting professionals. And then the accounting firms are tearing their hair out on that one too. They're just supply and demand. So the mid-level positions support mid-level professional positions, I think are in very high demand. And I think you're also seeing, where once people went to a family office and tended to stay for a very long time, I think with some of the mid-level positions, particularly, people are moving around more than they used to.
Yeah, I think what you'll see just forecasting a big need for is kind of that chief of staff, COO person, especially for maybe younger, less professionalized, institutionalized family offices, maybe a first generation wealth creator that is still very much in the game and he or she still wants to create more wealth, but they need somebody to be able to represent them in the room with these other third parties and to buy them time back. Those are roles that I increasingly see more and more need for.
Mm-hmm.
So I probably get a call a week from someone asking me a family office question. And one of the questions I get asked more than anything is they're looking for a resource or a person to help them with governance and education. And yet I still don't see firms kind of providing a lot of those resources or I'm not sure that there's a lot of talent out there. So maybe you could address that. Do you see that same need, and are people hiring governance and education professionals in-house? And I think probably more so for multifamily offices than single family offices, but generally, what are you seeing around those professionals and that service?
I think we definitely see the demand for it. Absolutely the demand for it. I think that tends to be an outsourced function though, still to this day. It's more rare to see someone, unless they're a very large family, have someone internally who is dedicated on a full-time basis to, education and things like that. The chief learning officer, as Brian mentioned, I think it still tends to be a function that people will go out to the market and try to find consultants or other providers to be able to come in and help them. The thing that's difficult there is that, like we were talking before, if it's a one-shot thing, it's like training. If it's a one-shot thing and you don't have a mechanism or a way in which to keep that going every day and make it a recurring kind of way of life as opposed to an event, it doesn't endure as well. But I think it's definitely a high need and very highly demanded. I think it's a question of how to best be able to serve that need in the future, and I think that'll be a challenge. And I don't know, Brian, what your perspective is?
Yeah, I agree with Linda pretty much across the board. We rarely see internal chief learning officer roles full time, even in really big families, unless they have an embedded family office where they have almost like an investor relations role within the operating company, or maybe they're majority stockholder of a publicly traded firm and they have that IR functionality. It's an odd role because if everything is going well, they're doing their job. They have a hard time defending their existence. It's very hard to quantify success in that world and in that role. And that's why you historically see a lot of these larger groups, these multifamily offices or potentially wirehouses, cycle through them. They bring them on, they do a good job, and then they're not revenue generative, and then they kind of exit. I do think it's best, in my experience, to have that outsourced function, somebody that can come in, be a third party, be the Dutch uncle, wear the black hat, have some hard conversations, and then exit. My experience has been that the people that are really good at it have no time. They're maxed out. There's just not enough hours in the day to do the work, but there just aren't enough really, really high quality practitioners. So it's a big opportunity for somebody if they want to step into that space.
And I want to add one last thing that Pat, you were the best of all time in that area. And I remember something, and I've repeated it so many times, when you were at Genspring, and you said they come to us for education and governance assistance and next gen assistance. Then they do other business with us. But the families really recognize the importance. If they don't have that, it doesn't matter how good your investment portfolio is. If you don't keep the family together and you don't have that side of it healthy and in good shape, the rest doesn't matter. It's kind of like, what good does all the money in the world mean if you don't have your health?
So you're right, Linda. Well, that is very helpful. So in a minute or so we have remaining, I would like both of you to give me any recaps you have or words of wisdom that you'd like to give those that have participated in this webcast today about the family office market.
I'll let Linda go first.
I think that I love the family office market and the private family business market. I think this country was built on private family business, and many of whom then become the family offices in the future as they have the liquidity and the ability to be able to do that. And I think that, to me, that is where the job opportunities are. That is where tremendous amount of philanthropy emanates from. And it's, from our standpoint, we love what we do in being able to help families accomplish their objectives and sustain themselves, their families, and legacies into future generations. So for any of you who are thinking about the family office world, we encourage you wholeheartedly. Working in service of families is fabulous. They're wonderful, wonderful families out there.
Yeah, I think there's a big misconception that the world is run on the public markets, and the reality is private enterprise that runs the world in terms of GDP and employment and entrepreneurism. And I think part of the uptick you're seeing in the candidates that want to work with families is some of these larger groups and firms, they've repeatedly disappointed a lot of people. And the ability to work with a family to help express that value system every day and to be of service, it's really appealing. That's one of my favorite parts about the job. So.
Well, thank you so much. I think we're at the top of the hour. I really think this has been an not only interesting, but an educational webcast. I know everyone, including myself, learned a lot. So appreciate both of you being on this webcast with us today.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Pat.
Appreciate it. Thank you, Pat.
So I want everyone to know on this webcast that is being recorded and it will be sent out. It will be also posted on our YouTube channel so you can view it again, or for those of you who weren't able to get on, you'll have an opportunity to do so. So thank you all again. Have a great rest of your day. Take care. Bye-bye.